So why is your mix sounding too quiet? Well, one of the main reasons, this might be something that you've overlooked, is actually because you haven't created enough clarity in the track yet. So what happens to a lot of producers is they fall into this trap where they're constantly using limiters, they're constantly checking how their song stacks up, like using analyzer plugins, and yeah, they're just struggling to get a mix that actually sounds loud. And the reason for this is you can often like fall into this trap of looking at numbers on the chart, or trying specific mixing techniques that you've heard about, and you fail to take into consideration the perceived loudness of a song, which is actually far more important. And it's really the only thing that you need to focus on. A lot of this other stuff is kind of like a distraction, but the real goal is to focus on perceived loudness and clarity and a great clear mix down. And this is really like triggering to some people to hear, because they're like, oh yeah, I know that that's what I need to be doing, but like my ears just aren't good enough yet. I can't like determine yet, what makes a good mix down and how to get my track to that level. Well, don't worry, because that's something that you will just be able to get over time anyway. It just takes a little bit of time to train your ears and figure out what you're doing wrong in your mix down. But that's something that you can get to. And so you gotta stop trying to shortcut things, like trying to use fancy limiters or fancy plugins, trying to like really get your track to be the same levels on a particular meter that you're using as like another professional track. Because when you're doing that, you're ignoring the key thing, which is a good sounding track with great perceived loudness. Yeah. And so how do you actually get perceived loudness? Well, that's actually, it comes into play when you think about dynamics and contrast, right? So how can you have a sound that's perceived to be loud? Well, you have to have a sound that's perceived to be quiet as well. So within the context of your mix, there has to be a range of sounds at different levels going on, and that's what creates perceived loudness and contrast. Because maybe you want your drums to just sound like they're proper crispy, really powerful, punchy and loud. Well, how are you going to do that if they're just in isolation? Then there's nothing to compare them to. So how you get your drums to sound really powerful and punchy and crispy, for example, is you have other sounds that are doing the opposite behind them. So you have other sounds in your track that are like really, really low, that are like beds almost, I call them. And you have other things that are contradicting to what the drums are trying to achieve. And in that distance between the elements that are behind and the drums which are in the foreground, in that distance, that creates the relationship, and that gives you that sense of perceived loudness of the drums, right? It's not just a fact that your drums are so loud that you've turned them up and now they're good. It's more than that. It's you need to give the impression of perceived loudness. So that's what you need to do in your mix down. You need to make that your goal, your northern star, if you will, in creating contrasts and dynamics by almost tricking the ear in a sense to create perceived loudness. And that's infinitely more important than trying to get a particular number on a readout, or trying to use like a limiter which changes the whole dynamics. Because a lot of producers, they start off using limiters on their mastering chain or whatever, but they actually haven't figured out the code of how to create perceived loudness in a mixdown. And the trick to making perceived loudness in a mixdown is to have your dynamics of your song all controllable and in control. And when you use a limiter, you're basically auto adjusting the whole dynamics of a track. And so if you haven't set up that separation, and you haven't created that intentional perceived loudness, which is a bit of a magic trick in a way, if you haven't done that, then limiting and other stuff that you're doing to try and shortcut the process is purely just going to destroy your mix, because you're missing like the fundamental part of mixing, which is dynamics and contrast, you know. And with dynamics and contrast, once you become a master of that, you're simply able to turn up your track. You're simply able to boost it, gain the track up to such a higher level than you previously would have done if you had not set up your mix down in such a way, you know? So it's really, really important. It's something that people continue to neglect and will continue to neglect for years, and will see this video and think, oh, that's useful, and then continue to neglect. All right, it's just this kind of thing that there's a lot of false information out there, and I try to be a little beacon of light and try and guide you in the right direction, but I know that you'll get swamped away in the sea of useless information and lose your way again. But I'll always be here when you want to come back and get that reality drilled back into you. And it's a bit of a harsh reality, because you have to develop your ears to be able to mix properly, and that's not something that can be achieved overnight. And so we want that quick fix, we want to find it now, you know, but it ain't gonna happen now. It's gonna happen as you keep going and keep being consistent and slowly piece the puzzles together of, you know, what sounds good, you know, how to EQ, improving yourself as a mixing engineer. This is a really fine art form. It takes a long time to do, you know. I could still improve my mixing and mastering further, but I've also been doing it already for over 12 or 14 years or so, and I'm pretty damn good now, but there's still room for me to grow as well. So yeah, it's just a thing that you've got to enjoy the process of training your ears, you know. And people will say like, oh, are there particular ear training apps or things like that? Maybe there are. I've never really used that myself. I've just gone through the motions of just producing and trying to get better each time, you know, just going through the motions. And you'll get there eventually when you do that, you know. Another thing though, just before I finish, I talk about perceived loudness and dynamics and contrast and stuff like that, you know, but none of this is going to help you or make sense if your mix down is also, if there's no clarity in it. You know, you have to get clarity in your mix down. That's another thing that's going to really, really make your track suffer in terms of the perceived loudness, and the whole sound quality is going to be, you know, unnecessary mud and unnecessary conflicts. You know, you need to become very, very selective with what sounds you use at the same time with each other. You need to become great at spotting where there's mud in a mix, and you need to become really good at solving conflicts between elements that are overlapping. Yeah, so think of it as two parts, two takeaways to this video that will, as practical things that will help you. Okay, number one is you strive for perceived loudness always, and you get the perceived loudness by creating intentional contrasts within the mixdown. And number two, you strive for maximum clarity. So you clear out resonant, muddy frequencies where they don't need to exist, okay? And you solve the conflicting, you solve the separation between sounds where they're conflicting through proper EQing or proper multiband sidechaining, that kind of thing, you know? You can go too far with taking out mud. You might sometimes think you're taking the mud out of a sound, but you're actually weakening the sound by taking those frequencies out. So that's something you have to be careful of as you go on this journey as well, because people will tell you have to take the mud out of the kick or the mud out of the bass, or you've got to take out the below the 30 hertz or below 20 hertz. You've got to cut that out because it's mud, right? But you have to always check with your ears and listen, because what you'll find often is EQing out the wrong part of a particular sound can actually weaken the sound in a way that's actually counterintuitive. So there's times when you take out the mud in the right area, and there's times where you leave actual important frequencies in as well, but you just clear out the rumble from the other sounds that needs to be cleared out. You know, but this sound can have more low end in if it needs it, you know. So it's a case by case thing for each sound. But yeah, as I mentioned, You go for volume perception. You do that by creating contrast and dynamism in your mixdown. And then you go for maximum clarity and separation between elements. And you do that by clever EQing, good sound selection, and good mixing tools like multi-band sidechaining. And when you do those things, when you focus just on those two things, you'll solve all of the problems in your mix, 90% of them, and then you'll have cleared the runway for volume to be achieved. You know, you can't just get volume from shortcuts and little tricks. I mean, there are little tricks to get your mix down better, but I'm talking about, you know, the classic things of comparing your tracks to the you know, looking at the numbers on other reference tracks and seeing if yours is that level, and yeah, like overusing limiters, overusing stuff on your mastering chain, all these kind of like shortcut things, you know, they're a bit, they take away from the goal, you know, which is you must get that perceived loudness and the mixdown clarity. And then I promise you, when you do both of those things, it's like you've cleared the whole runway and the whole airport is yours, ready to take off, and you can absolutely just turn up the volume on your track, and it's going to sound like super loud because you've cleaned everything up. All right, so that's hopefully a helpful video for you guys. Thanks a lot for watching. Please make sure you like and comment and subscribe to my channel. I highly appreciate it. And if you haven't joined my Patreon yet, what are you doing? Come and check it out. There's a link down below. We have like literally the best production community ever. Everyone is so friendly, super nice and welcoming. At some point, I imagine, like, if it gets too big, I will have to stop letting people in. But I think we've got a bit more space for a few more people still. So come along and join us in there. And if you guys ever need like more focused one-on-one help with your mixdowns, hit me up for production lessons. And finally, if you guys need any presets or samples, check out my website. Send me an email as well if you need any more information about anything like mastering services or stuff like that. All right, that's it from me today. More from me soon. Much love.